Well, good morning. Thank you all for appearing this morning. I also want to thank Director of Department of Child Safety, Greg McKay, for being here. The genesis for holding this briefing and taking a look at Arizona's child welfare system really came about as a result of the conclusion of the cases prosecuted against the adults who had care and responsibility for Ame Deal. And it's not often when we can look at a specific criminal prosecution and be able to tie it back to the genesis of changes in public policy and to see how it was a catalyst for change. And then be able to share with you too a series of specific milestones over that course in time and identify where some of those significant changes occurred. Director McKay, so I'm going to do that for you, and then Director McKay, given his own involvement in a lot of those changes, both statutory and organizationally and structurally within state government, can provide some greater details. That literally goes back to as well the investigation involving the death of Ame Deal. And in spending time on reflecting too about Ame's death and the cases that we prosecuted, which to underscore again concluded with the return of a sentence of death against Jonathan Allen and against Samantha Allen for their horrific torture and murder of Ame. I'm able to gather some small degree, very small degree, but a small degree of consolation that her death was not in vain in helping to serve as a catalyst for change. And the first date to highlight and pushing for change was August 10th of 2011. I stood at this very same podium roughly 8 months into my time in office and cataloged for you one horrific fatality each month that I had been in office. And that event is still very visible and easy to recall to my mind because it required me, in order to speak about those issues with some degree of knowledge, to review autopsies of child deaths and a number of infant fatalities too. But at that August 10, 2011 press conference, I announced the slate of charges we were going to file against the adults responsible for Ame's death. I announced too that we were going to seek the death penalty in the stopping death of a 4-year-old. And then I referenced several other deaths that had occurred, a number of which had involved prior contact with then Child Protective Services who had utterly failed those children. I also specifically referenced an interview that had been done with a neighbor of Ame's who had mentioned that he thought something was wrong, but he never got around to calling authorities or to seeking help for Ame. And at that time, I remember saying that, better for you to make a mistake in reporting child abuse and be embarrassed by it for a couple of weeks than to live a lifetime of regret and not having reported a situation where you could have been that child's saving angel. And unfortunately, that was the circumstance involving Ame. I also want to make sure to underscore too that Ame's death was different than several of the others that I highlighted that day because there had been no contact with Arizona's child welfare system at that point. There had been contact with the child welfare systems in 2 other states, and each time it appeared that people are about to catch on or catch up to the dynamic in which Ame was being abused, that group of individuals would move to another state until they finally came here to Arizona and Ame met her tragic end. So after that August 10th press conference, we did see, after a concerted effort to raise awareness in the community about the need to report child abuse, and that then, as now, if you make an honest mistake in reporting child abuse, Arizona law provides you with immunity from both criminal and civil prosecution. We saw a huge increase in reports of child abuse claims or allegations to Arizona's hotline. And we were learning then too that Arizona's hotline was not engineered to perform like we needed it to. There were no systems in place to properly screen cases or to get caseworkers or investigators out into the field to check into the facts and to help prevent a recurrence of the tragedies that I highlighted that day. Then in October of 2011, October 12th to be specific, Governor Brewer announced that she was forming a child safety task force, and she asked me to chair that. And I agreed to do it because I believed then that the staff of Governor Brewer's office, who were working with me to figure out what this task force was going to look like, was committed to change, and that this was not going to be just an exercise in discussing issues without coming up with concrete plans for how to affect real change and to make outcomes different for children in Arizona. And I also remember very vividly the very first break we took during the very first hearing. I took questions from reporters, and the most frequent and prevalent question was, do you really think something's going to change this time? Because Arizona had gone through these iterations in the past, and all it had been really was an exercise in moving the chairs around on the deck of the Titanic. And my response was that by accident or design, Governor Brewer had asked a former tank platoon leader to lead her task force, and I had been trained that when I got to an obstacle, I went through it, over it, or around it, and that we were going to make significant change. There was no other option. In December of that year, the Child Safety Task Force released a series of recommendations that included statutory changes, procedural recommendations, and structural changes, too, to how child welfare investigations, specifically allegations of criminal conduct, were to be conducted. And the recommendation was to create an Office of Child Welfare Investigations that would not report to the Director of Child Protective Services, but that would report directly to the Director of the Department of Economic Security, to provide a degree of independence, to help change the culture in which criminal allegations were investigated, and help come up with a way for the public to have confidence, too, that if they were going to report a case of criminal conduct, that it would be thoroughly investigated, as well as to provide an environment in which specific training for child welfare investigators could occur, so that we would have the opportunity for a better partnership between law enforcement and child welfare investigators that would more reflect the expectations from our joint investigative protocol that we have within Maricopa County, and that every county in Arizona has. It's the responsibility of a county attorney to develop in conjunction with stakeholders that includes child welfare investigators as a result of this recommendation, and law enforcement. As a result of that, we started to see greater partnership, a higher percentage of cases following that joint investigative protocol, and we started to see much better outcomes in terms of confirming or denying allegations, and in partnership between child welfare investigators and law enforcement. And the OCWI was created in statute in 2012. Then in November of 2013, the Office of Child Welfare Investigations discovered that there were over 6,000 cases within CPS that had been labeled NI, or not investigated. At that time, I was also serving on the Legislative Oversight Committee for CPS in an effort to make sure that recommendations that had initially been made, particularly those that involved statutory changes and that sought to reform the culture within CPS, were not just going to be passed over, but would take hold and grow and help reform that entity. And I remember when those 6,000 cases were discovered, it was, I think, a violation of the community's trust that the efforts that had gone into identifying things that needed to be done differently were being done differently, but weren't being done differently to change outcomes and results. Then in January 2014, in reaction to that and in reaction to other recommendations that had been made by the Child Safety Task Force, many recommendations which at that point in time then, I think there was a collective assessment that CPS was incapable of actually implementing them and making real changes. Governor Brewer created a new standalone cabinet agency to oversee child welfare, and CPS was taken out of the Department of Economic Security and made a standalone entity. And then between that move in January 2014 and May of 2014, There were a series of stakeholder meetings, and by stakeholder I mean everybody who had an interest in the child welfare system, from those involved in providing behavioral health services, to those involved in foster care, to those involved in law enforcement, the legislature, those involved in child welfare system at the state level got together to figure out, all right, what does the structure now need to look like to be able to implement the acknowledged changes that we needed to see within our child welfare system? And the new Department of Child Safety was created. Now, a couple last things I want to underscore before I ask Director McKay to come forward and fill in the holes in those milestones that I've mentioned. First, I'm noting milestones that resulted in real change. But this is not a victory lap. We still have cases involving horrific abuse and the deaths of children. On December 1st of this year, just a few weeks ago, the Maricopa County Grand Jury returned a multi-count indictment involving the death of a small child here within Maricopa County. And there was prior contact with the Department of Child Safety. So this is not a rah-rah speech at all. But I think, nonetheless, it's important to acknowledge a few things. Number one, this office's relationship with the agency responsible for overseeing the state's child welfare system is 180 degrees from what it was 6 years ago. 6 years ago, you would not have seen a posting on that child's death on the state child welfare agency's website. And yet it went up yesterday evening. There's a press release that went out this morning to provide more details about that death. I hope you can recognize that 6 years ago, not only would that not have happened the day before, the day of, or maybe even 6 months after, but I would have been stonewalled in my efforts as the county attorney to get information in the first place and to have prior contacts acknowledged. It's 180 degrees different. And while we will continue to work and to ask stakeholders throughout the community to hold DCS accountable, to hold Director McKay accountable, to hold me accountable, to follow through on our prior commitments, I'm here today to also say that I am committed to continuing to work to improve our child welfare system. And for however far we may have come in the last 6 years, however far we may be today, there's still more that has to be done. And I still have to acknowledge, too, that we will continue to struggle with the evil side of human nature that sees small human beings as objects of taking out rage, frustration, or simply failing to do the most basic of things that a parent should do for their child. And every time that happens, we hurt. We're all a little bit less for that because we fail to live up to the most basic of expectations of adults within our society. So at this point, I'm going to ask Director McKay to come forward and to share information related to and anchoring the beginning point of where real changes started to occur and share some of the improvements and things that we can acknowledge. And it's good for us to acknowledge it. We need the continued involvement of folks within the community. So where we can give hope for change, where we can acknowledge improvements, I think it's necessary to do that. We still need more behavioral health providers for children in foster care. We still need people willing to step forward and to foster children who have to be removed from their circumstances until their parents are able to take them back in. Or if their parents aren't ever going to be able to take them back in, we still need families willing to accept those children and to give them a forever home. And we're still going to have to continue to partner together to identify those circumstances where children have been harmed in a criminal way, to hold those offenders accountable, to try to provide some degree of justice and validate for those children that their lives have meaning and that we care. Director McKay.